Hi, I'm Scott McGuire, and thanks for joining me in this last segment of our series. Today I want to talk about co-creative gardening. And I know that's kind of a catchphrase, so I want to get into real specifically what I mean by that. So far, we've talked about a lot of different kinds of techniques in gardening. We've talked about soil building, how to raise plants, how to plant them, all different aspects that could all be lumped together as a collection of techniques. But that's not everything that's going on here. A lot of what I do in the garden is kind of invisible, kind of behind the scenes. And if you really want to grow good plants, the way I'm doing here, it's a whole lot more than just a collection of techniques on how to do that. Essentially, what you really have to do is think like a plant. Everything that allows you to think like a plant is going to help your plants grow better. The key to understanding that is to know that plants are simply, their basic mechanism is a water pump. They're pulling water out of the ground and they're evaporating water out of their leaves. And as long as you're aware that that's what's going on and you're thinking about how can that process always be made better, then you're well on your way to thinking like a plant. Now I know a lot of people talk to their plants. Not all of us gardeners admit it, but I know people that really love their plants, just can't help talking to them. They walk through their garden saying this and saying that, and that's all fine and good. But how many people know that the garden wants to talk back? A lot of people talk to their plants. How many people listen to what their plants actually have to say? Now I know we're not brought up thinking that that's even possible. We're all raised in this culture, the scientific understanding. We think plants are just little biological mechanisms, right? They're just little blobs of protoplasm doing their photosynthesis, and they go through their little mechanistic functions, and that's about all they are. Well, I'm here to tell you that that's just not true. Plants are not like that. Plants have an awareness of their conditions. They know where they are and what they're growing. Plants have a set of preferences. They like certain conditions and they really don't like certain other ones. So how can we find out from the plant itself what it wants and what it might like? How can we find out from the whole entire garden what is the best way to approach the whole entire garden? That's really the question that's intrigued me for all these years. And what I found out is that plants are more of a who than a what. The garden isn't a thing out there, it's more of a collection of beings. So how do we enter into a conversation with this magnificent group of creatures that you've assembled to become your garden? Well, that's what I want to talk about today in the co-creative garden. But let's back up a little. Let's talk about what I call all the different plant relationship systems. Because there's lots of different systems of gardening out there. There's lots of definitions about all these different ways of gardening. So what I want to do is review the way I frame them all in what I call plant relationship systems. Now, the worst one, of course, is the chemical plant relationship system. And sorry to say, that's the one most of us have with our grocery stores and with the agribusiness food chain. Highly chemical intensive. Even the backyard gardeners who use chemicals and herbicides and fungicides and the blue water fertilizer, all that junk is not anything that helps soil life. It doesn't build soil, and it basically cranks up the plants into a false display of life force. But they're not very healthy, and you're not going to get very healthy eating chemical plants. So the chemical approach to gardening is the pure opposite of where we're going to end up today. Okay? The remedy to chemical gardening is what's become known as organic gardening. Now, organic is a really diverse label, and we could spend an hour talking about what organic means or doesn't mean. Okay? As far as garden techniques, most times what people mean by organic is what's not in there. Okay? Organic gardening techniques mean you don't use chemical fertilizers. You don't use chemical herbicides, pesticides, or any kind of biocide. Anything that kills anything directly isn't exactly your approach. The organic approach is to build soil, have healthy plant relationships, basically starting from a point of do no harm. But what's happened is a lot of the organic techniques have been taken over by some of the chemical approaches to gardening. So organic is a great beginning place, but it's not exactly the cutting edge of the best gardening practice these days. But now there are many different kinds of organic gardening and farming that we can talk about. One of these plant relationship systems that I use a lot, and it informs a whole lot of my gardening, is the system called Biodynamics. Biodynamics is a system that came about from Rudolf Steiner, the person who invented the Waldorf school approach to education also. Rudolf Steiner came up with biodynamics, which is a comprehensive, cosmic way of seeing all the earth fits together, all the plants and the stars and the sun and moon and everything. It's a complete cosmology and plant science all rolled into one. It's very strict in its application and its practices. Adherence to biodynamic practices are very precise in their following of Steiner's directions. I'm not a strict practitioner of biodynamics, but a lot of that philosophy informs what I do. Now there's another plant relationship system that's similar to biodynamics in name, called Biointensive. Now biointensive gardening is a plant relationship system that's championed by John Jevons. And it's a wonderful system where he talks about how you can grow everything that you need, including the composting plants that you need for fertility. John Jevons' biointensive system talks about ways that you can grow your fertility along with your foodstuffs. And that's a real important piece that a lot of backyard gardeners haven't really figured in. Now, there's another plant relationship system that's kind of a catchword these days, and that's called permaculture. Now, permaculture is a very specific trademark term for an entire collection of ecological farming and gardening practices that was founded by a guy named Bill Mollison. Permaculture has taken off worldwide as a wonderful model for perennial food systems of all different kinds, based on ecologically sound approach of wherever it is. Sound local techniques for cycling water, for maintaining fertility. Permaculture is a lot of ancient knowledge and a lot of new techniques put together in one big approach. Now I draw from all these different plant relationship systems. I've learned a lot from all of them. I've studied permaculture, I've studied the biointensive. I'll always be a student of Rudolf Steiner and the biodynamic work. But I'm not an adherent to any particular one of those plant relationship systems. The plant relationship system that I use is what I call co-creative gardening. And it's not a term I made up. It was a term that was created by Michelle Small-Wright, a woman who's founded the Perelandra Nature Research Institute in Virginia. Co-creative gardening involves really talking with your garden to get information about how to grow the best garden from the garden itself. The challenge is, how do you bridge the language barrier between non-speaking species? The way we do that is with muscle testing. Now, muscle testing, or applied kinesiology, has been used in a lot of alternative healing modalities for quite a few years now. I've used muscle testing in the garden setting for easily the past 30 years, drawing on techniques from Perelandra as well as Findhorn. Now, Findhorn was a community that started in Scotland in the late 60s. They got on the map by communicating with the higher intelligence of the plant beings in their garden. This caused quite a splash in the early 70s because they were able to grow incredible specimens of plants way up in the North Country out of sand, in conditions that were impossible, or so it seemed, and yet here were these magnificent gardens in the middle of nowhere. How could they do that? They claimed they did it with the help of the angels of these plants. Now, what's happened is a lot of the terminology and understanding of how to communicate with nature and how to have a co-creative gardening relationship, a lot of that terminology has been couched in really arcane, new age, metaphysical terms. And a lot of times those terms don't really serve to uh, help explain what's going on, and it certainly doesn't make any of these techniques more accessible to a lot of the farmers and gardeners and ranchers who could really use them to uh, help their operations and their own relationships with nature. Now, the real difference between co-creative gardening and all of these other plant relationship systems is not in any of the techniques involved, but it has to do with how do we approach the plant species itself. Simply, is it a who or is it a what? All the all the permaculture plant relationship systems, all the biointensive systems, they're all as ecologically informed as they can be, but they're not an actual partnership. It's still human beings decided to the best of our ability. It's us deciding what we're going to do in the garden. So here's an example. I'm a green lifestyle sort of guy. I recycle everything and I conserve water and electricity, and I'm doing the best I can here, right? So I want to grow more of my own food. So I want to grow an apple tree. So I march on down to the nursery and I buy myself an apple tree, and I come home in my backyard and I dig a hole and I plant my apple tree. Now, who can fault any of that? That's all good stuff. I'm trying to feed myself, I'm growing trees, all this sort of thing. And I wouldn't fault any of that except for one thing, and that's the difference between how I would do it and how anyone else would do it in any of those other plant relationship systems. Because even with its in the best of intentions, that approach is still a manipulation. I'm deciding what kind of apple tree. I'm deciding where it goes in the yard. I'm deciding exactly when to plant it, which direction to face it. And the truth is that apple tree, the yard, all of the pieces involved, they all have a point of view about that whole situation. And they all have a way of letting me know as the gardener what that point of view is. So do I just go out there and do everything myself, or do I bring in all the garden elements into that conversation? That's the core difference between cooperation and manipulation. So by now you've had a chance to see my whole scene, my whole garden, everything here. And I have to tell you that I did not decide where anything went in this garden. Say, oh, Scott Allen McGuire, garden designer, he designed this whole garden. Yeah. Well, no, I didn't. I didn't decide where anything goes. Everything growing in my garden decided where it wanted to be. What I've been able to figure out is how to get that information from the plants so that wherever I put them, they're going to be the happiest they can be. The best way I've learned to explain all this is to make an analogy to Chinese medicine. Now, most people who are familiar with acupuncture or acupressure, they've seen that chart on the wall of all the meridians, the human body with all the lines going through all the different acupuncture points. They're called meridians, and they're energy lines all over the human body, okay? When we allow the plants in a garden to have input into where they are going to grow in that garden body, if they design that garden body themselves, well, what they do is design energy meridians, in a sense, into that garden body. So that garden body is going to be, as a whole, a lot healthier than that exact same collection of plants would be if I happen to put them wherever I happen to think they should go, even based with all these techniques we've talked about. The thing that makes the difference is allowing the plants that extra measure of cooperation in the whole of the garden. When the plants are able to have their say into where they go, when they go there, and what their conditions are going to be when they're there, then you're going to have an explosion of vitality and health out of that garden that's going to be quite distinct from any other manipulative method of gardening, no matter how benign or well-informed it is. Now this is where all the design work for the garden really begins. I sit down here with a complete map of my whole garden. Now if you haven't done a drawing and made a map of your whole garden area, I recommend that you do that right away, because that's the bottom line ground, the clear slate, you know, the stretched canvas that you're going to create your painting on. So I start with the map, and I start with my list of plants. All winter long, I'm dreaming about last year's garden, what worked, what didn't work, what are the plants that I want to grow again this year, what are the new plants that I want to grow. All those questions come up in the winter. So all winter long, I'm making up my plant lists, thinking of all the things that I want to grow next year. When I have my list of plants together, I take my list of plants and my map, and I sit down and I have what's called a co-creative design session. Now, a lot of it requires me to have a very clear focus in my head. I invite the entire garden to be present and part of this design process. And I use muscle testing to ask very specific questions, like, where do the carrots grow? Do the carrots grow in this section or in this section? And when I narrow that down, then I take a smaller map of that section that I've made photocopies of it, and I write in, okay, do the carrots grow in bed number 1, bed number 2, bed number 3? And we muscle test it all out. So the whole entire design process is me taking my list of plants and the map of the garden and matching them all up. So the question we always need to keep in mind is, what's going on in this garden this year? What is the best result we can have in this time and in this place? Because there aren't really any other times and places. There are no general techniques that work everywhere equally. Our question is all about what's going to work here and what's going to work here this year. So that's the basic design process, muscle testing what plants you want to grow, where you want to grow them. Now, it's not an appropriate question in this context to go out and ask your garden, well, you don't have to ask permission. Is it okay if I grow carrots, or is it all right if I grow lettuce? That's a wrong way to frame it. Nature doesn't care what we grow. We get to decide what we want to grow. We're the growers. We're the ones who are going to use the plants, and we're actually the human gardener. So we're the ones who decide what plants we want to grow. Now, how do we grow them, and where do we grow them? That's all the domain of the plants themselves. And we'd be really wise if we listened to them on how to do all that. But once you have all your plants mapped out as to where they're going to go, then there's another follow-up step to asking, when are they supposed to be planted there? The timing of everything is as important as the specifics of everything. Because what happens in this garden this year has never happened before. What grew really well here last year, it might not grow so well this year. Other things that have never grown well here might grow really well here under a different condition or a different location in the garden, or some other variable gets changed. So the question we always need to keep in mind is, what's going on in this garden this year? What is the best result we can have in this time and in this place? Because there aren't really any other times and places. There are no general techniques that work everywhere equally. Our question is all about what's going to work here and what's going to work here this year. So now the way it works out in the strict Paralandra co-creative model, and that's what this is, the techniques of co-creative design. Sometimes that happens, a lot of it happens in the wintertime, but honestly, a lot of it happens as we go. When I'm in the garden every day, I prioritize by asking, what is it that most needs to be done today? What is the highest good action that I need to do in this garden that's more important than anything else? Because in a way, knowing what to do in the garden is only half of it. We also have to know when to do everything. Timing in the garden is everything. So we need to be able to cooperate with the garden co-creatively to not only find out what to do, but when is the best time to do it. Now, obviously, this is a pretty complex system of relating to plants. It's a lot to dive into, and how to do it is a whole lot more than we can get into right now. But that's going to be the subject of a future series, how to take this co-creative gardening process further into your garden or your farm or your ranch. Whatever context it is that you're going to have your relationship with nature in, this is a tool that can help build that relationship into a sound and balanced harmony over the years. Now, we've looked at the co-creative design process using muscle testing and attunement to figure out what plants go where. But where else can we use that attunement and muscle testing in the garden itself? Well, here's a place. If you recall last year, this is where we sowed the cover crop. And this cover crop has now grown up for the last few months, and it's gotten pretty lush and pretty thick. So by now you can figure out that we've muscle tested all along what to grow in this bed, when to grow it, and we decided to film it. And now I need to ask, okay, when is the best time to harvest this cover crop? What is the best time to do that? Then what is the best way to treat the material? Should I compost it right away? Should I let it dry? Real technical questions that I may not know the answer to. I can ask the situation. I can ask the crop itself. I can ask the garden in the garden bed. I've already had to ask, well, what's going to grow in this space this year? And so my map already has an indication of what particular crop I'm going to grow in this space. But there are a lot of other questions I need to have answered in the meantime, such as how to clear this crop out for that one and how to get the space ready. These are all questions framed in a yes-no format that you can get answered on the spot through your co-creative connection with your garden. Now, how is it done? The technique, I'll show you a little simplified version that I use. The most important thing is to be as mindful as possible. So no matter what I've been doing in the garden, running around, usually doing a lot of things at once is how it usually works out. I'll take a moment, if I need to get some information, I'll take a moment to take a few deep breaths, quiet myself down, and really just tune in to that particular situation. Now, I can ask the plants or I can ask that bed. It doesn't really matter how I frame it. It's just a matter of having mindful focus around the question at hand. It's really more of a question of holding that focus than it is a technique of the muscles themselves. So the way I would approach it is, I would ask, when is the best time to harvest this crop? And then I would ask, today, tomorrow, 3 days from now. I would muscle test each one of these options. And as I ask these questions, all I really do is try to hold this muscle very strong. And if it holds strong, then that's a yes answer. And if it goes weak, if this muscle here mushes out when I try to hold it strong, then that's a no answer to the question. So that's all I really do, is hold a clear focus in my head, one question at a time. What is the highest good for right now in the situation? And if you frame your questions that way and you trust your accuracy, you'll get some great results. Now, co-creative gardening might seem like an incredibly complicated thing. I mean, once you've accepted the fact that a plant is an intelligent being and has a point of view, it can be kind of intimidating to have a conversation with someone that you never thought would be possible. But to me, it's a whole lot more intimidating to try to imagine that I would have to physically learn everything I need to know to be a good gardener. Because there is so much to know. I mean, I've been gardening 30 years, and I've read a lot of books, and it's been a passion of mine. And so you would think that, well, after 30 years of studying gardening, maybe it's just because this guy's learned so much about gardening. Well, the truth is, I haven't learned hardly anything. But what I have learned is how to ask questions. So the truth is, we don't really need to know very much at all. We just need to know how to ask a clear yes-no question and how to interpret the answers. Then as soon as we go and act on that information, then it'll unfold to get more information, and on and on. See, the truth is, every single thing that's known in all of horticulture, every single truth about how do we raise plants, everything that's known, none of it is an answer to anyone's question. All of it is a source of questions. The questions that we need to ask of our gardens and ourselves. And those answers are what we really need to work with for what is appropriate right here, in the here and now. So I guess in a very real sense, the co-creative gardening relationship with the intelligence of nature, it's more than just a garden path. I guess it's really a personal growth path. In a way, your garden is a direct reflection of you, because everything that you are, all that you bring to it, gets reflected by the garden and absorbed by the garden and reflected back to you. It reminds me of a quote by one of my garden heroes, Alan Chadwick. And he was quite fond of saying, "The gardener doesn't make the garden." He says the garden makes the gardener. So here's hoping you become the kind of gardener that you want to be. Thanks for joining me.